Welcome to the Plant-Centered and Thriving Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Kitchens. Welcome to the podcast. My name is Ashley, and I am so grateful you are here today. How are you doing today, by the way? I don't feel like I ask you that. And with the holidays coming up and it just being a busy season in general, I hope that you're finding some time for yourself and you're also maybe potentially planning ahead for the next wild few weeks that we have ahead of us. So the reason I say that is because today our guest, Kate, we talk a little bit about the holidays and what she did when she transitioned to plant-based to kind of help her prepare to be in non-plant-based environments while she was transitioning. So we talk about that just a little bit. I am thrilled to welcome Kate to the show. So I talk about this in the actual podcast, but Kate and I met at the retreat. She was one of our guests, and every guest was phenomenal. And I was so grateful that Kate came onto the show to share her story. She has a very unique story. So, Kate is a clinical psychologist in New York City, and she was diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis when she was 15 years old. After years of being on and off medications like NSAIDS, which she talks about, and which contributed to creating digestive issues, Kate pursued a path of managing her arthritis symptoms with nutrition at the age of 30. So she's diagnosed at 15, and she really doesn't start getting into nutrition until 30. So think about that, 15 years. And she goes into all those details for us. She's been primarily plant-based for almost 9 years, and she has not been on medications for her arthritis since making this change. Can you believe that, y'all? This story is incredible. It just speaks to the power of nutrition and how food can have an impact on how we feel. So I'm so thrilled to welcome Kate to the show. Please join me in welcoming her and her incredible story. Welcome to the show, Kate.
Hi, Ashley. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. I'm so excited to talk with you. And for those of you who are listening, Kate and I met at our retreat earlier this year, and it was such a blast to have her there. And it was so cool too, because I feel like we got to know everyone on a really intimate level.
Mhm.
And so when I asked for people to come on the podcast to share their story, Kate jumped on it. And I was so thankful because secretly I really wanted her to come on anyway. So she's going to share her story with us today, which I'm thrilled to get into. Before we do that, Kate, would you mind just giving us a little background on yourself and what you do and anything else
Yeah.
that comes to mind?
Yeah. As Ashley said, my name is Kate. I'm a clinical psychologist who lives and practices in New York City. I have actually been working with individuals on the autism spectrum for like 16 years. And so my practice is really primarily like focused in that area. And I work with like adolescents and adults. And that's been a journey. And actually, part of my plant-based journey ended up having to do with some of my coworkers that I never would have met if I hadn't been working
Oh,
in that field. So that it's relevant in that way. I am married and a mom of a 4-year-old, and I have 2 cats.
yes. Two cute little cats.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, good. Well, I'm excited to hear about this plant-based connection. So kind of as we get into that, I would love for you to give us a background on kind of how your plant-based journey even started.
Yeah. So actually sort of like this circuitous route, I guess is a good way to put it. I was 15 when I was diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and I was in high school and I was a cheerleader, and every impact was hurting my joints, right? And you cannot be a cheerleader without constant impact moves. It got to the point where like my low back I was having a lot of pain. I was like rolling an ankle regularly, and finally ended up getting like blood work done and saw a pediatric rheumatologist, and they diagnosed me with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. There's like a history of autoimmune stuff in my family, so it wasn't like totally mind blowing. And so I think the other piece that was like really kind of cool about like having a family with that history is like, we're just like, all right, well, this is a thing. This is a thing we're going to manage, but like, it's not a defining thing. So I
Mm.
never felt like, oh my God, now I have arthritis and my life is, oh, like I didn't have that like identity piece to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're 15. I mean, and you're cheerleading. I mean, and when you're 15, like, I have my whole life ahead of me, and I,
Right.
potentially want to take cheer to the next level. So, yeah, what was that like?
Yeah, I just I just was like, all right, well, what do we do? Like, how do I manage it? And, traditional medicine, you manage it with nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory. So NSAIDs. So I had already, because side note, military family, military medical facilities overprescribe NSAIDs. So I had already been on like way higher doses of like ibuprofen than most people should
Mm.
ever be exposed to. And so was like not responsive to any of like your kind of more traditional NSAIDs.
And you were put on those because you're already kind of experiencing the pain, even probably
Yeah.
prior to even being
Yep.
diagnosed.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
And so I was on like Celebrex and then tried this, just different medications. And I kind of was on intermittent trials through like the rest of high school and college, and would notice that like anytime I did any high impact exercise, so like running is like, even now if I were to run, it's basically like an automatic inflammation response in like my ankles, my knees, my hips now because I'm almost 40. um and so that's fine. There are other things I can do. I don't need to do high impact exercise.
Yeah. So did you end up quitting cheerleading or
I
how did
s-
that go?
I stayed cheering through the remainder of high school.
Wow.
Just sort of like figured out what do I need to do to modify things. I like took
Yeah.
out some of the high impact stuff, and my coach was supportive. So that was kind of like, I guess, what happened there. And then I feel like from there I sort of just like meandered through my 20s, where sometimes I would be on meds, sometimes I wouldn't. For me, waking up in pain was normal. It was
Wow.
like, I felt like I was like, oh, I just like made fun of myself. Like I coped with
Yeah.
humor, right? I'm like, I'm just like, I'm like an old lady. I just wake up. I'm like achy. I gotta like take time. I can't just like pop out of bed.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of just how I lived. And I
Yeah.
didn't know to like look for anything different. I didn't think to look for anything different.
And so like the doctors at this point are basically just prescribing medications. And I mean, that was what you had access to. So that's sort
Yep.
of what you went with.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I just didn't even like think anything. My sister, meanwhile, for animal rights reasons, was vegan at one point, but never ever like talked to me about like the health component of a plant-based. And so I just didn't even think about, had no idea. And then I was talking with a friend and colleague at work who also works in my same community, same population. And we both had young friends who had breast cancer. And so this whole all started, I wasn't even looking for something for my arthritis. It was just we're telling a story about having young friends with breast cancer.
Yeah.
And we both were having this like freak out of like, we know that not all cancer can be prevented, but we do know that some things can be prevented. We know there's genetics, we know, right? Like we know there's all these different factors. And we both just decided, we're like, well, we heard about this book, Eat to Live.
Oh, yes.
And so I was turning 30, and after I turned 30, I decided, I was like, I'm literally transitioning jobs. I'm going from this one job on Long Island. I had been doing a crazy commute. I was like not feeling great in my body, couldn't squeeze in exercise because my commute was like an hour and a half each way. It was just like
Oh my
nuts.
gosh. Yeah.
And I literally went on vacation. I was sitting on the beach in Jamaica and I was reading Eat to Live.
Oh my gosh. Some
I
light
was
reading for the beach.
sitting there, I'm reading Eat to Live, and I'm like, everything I'm eating in this like all-inclusive vacation, I was like, well, this is the last time I'm eating this.
Yes.
I just sort of like decided while I was on the vacation that when I got back, I was done eating that way,
Wow.
and learned so much from Eat to Live. And now having like learned, I mean, that was 9 years ago. So having learned, more and more, I definitely see like the value of what that book offered. I also see things now that I disagree with, but I am, grateful for how it really precipitated my plant-based journey, because literally I would say within like a month or two of being plant-based, I didn't wake up in pain anymore.
Wow. For the first time
Um,
in probably a long time.
in like 15 years. Yeah.
Wow. Gosh, what was
Yeah.
that like? And did you make
It
that
was
connection of like, oh, it might have something to do with the way I'm eating?
so kind of given, my background as a psychologist, I was like I was doing a lot of the background research, like, okay, they made this reference. Let me actually go look at that study. Like, what is the research? And so I went into like making plant-based adjustments with like a very specific goal in my mind of reducing my body's inflammation.
Wow.
That was the why, right?
Yeah.
Like it was like, okay, and not even thinking like I want to reduce my symptoms necessarily. It was like I want to reduce the level of inflammation in my body and like what will happen if I do that.
Yeah. Yes. So why not give it a try?
That was what happened. I like noticed right away. I was like, hey, my joints don't hurt. I'm not swelling. Even like response to humidity, right? Like when it's humid, my hands used to swell.
Yeah.
Nope, none of that anymore.
Wow. So, okay. So you're having this conversation with your friend. You both have the Eat to Live book
Yes.
connection that came up, and then you're
Yep.
on a beach in Jamaica reading this book. And then really within 2 months, it sounds like that's
Mhm.
about like, how did that period go? Because I know like kind of flipping the switch and changing your diet, that's a big deal.
Yeah. So, I mean, I fortunate or unfortunate, I don't know. When I like sort of, I'm one of those people like when I see something, I like grab a bone, I like dive all in. I mean, I think you learned that about me on the retreat,
Yes.
perhaps. So I just was like, this is what I'm doing. I, I'm just committing to doing it. I would say the one thing that I did during my transition and like in Eat to Live, they are pretty supportive of is I definitely kept more like sustainably sourced fish and eggs in my diet, like during, especially in the beginning. And I still keep those in very sparingly, but that has more to do with like maintaining other like levels in my blood work and other fun things that I like still do now. But yeah, so for the most part, I'm whole food plant-based with the exception of those like two things. And that's super, super rare at this point. And I have been for 9 years. That transition, that initial transition, in terms of my experience of it was totally fine. In terms of the experience of other people around me, I would
Mm,
say
yes.
they weren't so happy about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
how did that go? Because I mean, you're really changing your diet in a short period of time. And so for you, like you said, it wasn't too bad, but other people usually are the ones who kind of make it a bit more challenging. So yeah, what was that like?
So my partner at the time, who I'm not with anymore, he was supportive, but then, and I really did the cooking and by it because that is like always been, I love cooking and I love food. I was like, well, this is what I'm cooking now. So you can eat it or you can cook something else.
Yep.
Um, sorry, not sorry. One of the other things that I think really like pursued as a challenge, and this was 9 years ago, and like the accessibility of plant-based foods was very different at that time. I mean, there were definitely things, but it's not like it is now.
Right.
And it's interesting because I know there's a lot of like talk about like food and like holidays and how we like holidays shouldn't be about food, but I'm like, but they are about food. And like I actually had a whole like my in my grad program in my diversity class, my project was on exploring the culture of food.
Oh, wow. Fascinating.
uh, and so like I very much like see how like cultures celebrate and honor relationships and through food, and there's certainly dysfunctional things that happen in that, but there's also a lot of really like functional, beautiful, celebratory components of food. And so I think for me, one of the things that I was like, really, how do I do this is like, I guess one of like my missions that I like really dove into in the beginning was like, how do I make like holiday foods that are plant-based? And so finding things like I have like this like Thanksgiving risotto it's like a baked risotto that I make
Ooh.
that's like, oh, it's so good. And creamy with, no cream.
Uh-huh.
Figuring out even like, how do I make this like holiday casserole thing that we always made? How do I take it and make that plant-based? Like what? And so a lot of like playing with that. And now I'm like super comfortable with like, no, we're going to do all of these things that are holiday actually.
Yeah.
And thanks to you and Katie's post, I totally sponsored a turkey.
Oh,
And
yay! I'm so glad to hear that.
and I was like, I'm already thinking about our plant-based Thanksgiving.
Oh,
So
yes.
I found like ways of it's okay for things to be plant-based, but also like making food fun and celebratory. And it's still
Yep.
okay to celebrate with food and, engage socially in that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great point, and because the holidays are coming up for those of you listening, exactly what Kate is saying when she's already I mean, it's early November and she's already planning ahead for Thanksgiving, which is especially when you're plant-based and maybe you don't go to like a plant-based Thanksgiving, it can be really helpful to plan ahead. That way you can come up with maybe just some fun things that also taste really good that might win some people over, or at the very least, like open their eyes to that like plant-based food can taste just as good and not look weird or funny or wild or anything like that.
My in-laws actually are, omnivores and have attended numerous Thanksgivings with me, and I allow them to bring the turkey, but then all of everything else has been plant-based. And most of the time they're like, "Oh, you would never know this is vegan. You would never." And I'm like, "Because most of our foods don't need to be made with dairy and all those other
Mhm.
things."
There's so many great alternatives these days where you really can't tell the difference, which is a really great thing. So S
Yes.
so I'm curious, Kate, kind of going back to this transition and you waking up to, like, not being in as much pain as you were, did you end up having conversations with your doctors, or did anything change with your medications? What did that kind of look like?
I just basically decided I wasn't going to be taking any of those medications anymore. Yeah. And then what I ended up pursuing really on my own, because I felt like the doctors that I saw, like if I mentioned like, oh, I went plant-based and these things happen, they were kind of like, oh, that's cool. So I ended up pursuing a functional medicine practice because I knew that what I wanted was to work with a physician who would really be able to look at the whole picture and not just think like prescribe, prescribe, prescribe. And I mean, I during this time kind of went down my own like rabbit hole with understanding like the FDA, the World Health Organization, like all these other things. Again, because I'm super research oriented, I was like, let me delve into this. And
Yes.
then had some eye-opening readings. And that was when I really, decided that I wanted to pursue something that was more functional in nature and looking at like the root cause of things and kind of what do we, how do we go from there? And so that's really what I did. I mean, it's been I guess about 5 years since I started working with a functional medicine practitioner. And, I have like the best understanding I've ever had of like my blood work, of like what all my numbers mean. I've done things like worn a continuous glucose monitor to understand like the timing of like when should I be eating for my body? Not again, like, because everyone's so different. Like,
Yep, yep.
it's so right. When should I be eating for my body? Or how do certain foods affect me? Knowing what to eat for me, like before I go to bed. Like it's just all, it's been really nice because I've been able to do so much with maintaining a whole foods plant-based diet, been able to do a lot, and I have stayed off of meds for them. I haven't like needed to be on them.
Wow.
um yeah, and I think now the biggest things that I like am astutely aware of are like, oh, when I don't get enough sleep my joints hurt.
I was wondering about that, if you notice some things just in your day-to-day routine where it's like, "Okay, that's why I'm not feeling great right now."
Yeah, so I would say that's one of like the gifts of changing my diet, is that now I can really see all the other lifestyle pieces of like, how does that impact me?
Yeah.
Right. So, oh, if I don't get enough sleep, my joints hurt. Hands down, 100% of the time, I know that to be true. If I drink a little too much, like it's not just like, oh, like then my joints will hurt for that. And so I would say like a very clear understanding of how what I consume and how my actions can impact my inflammation levels.
Yeah.
And so that's been like tremendous. I also notice if I'm like stagnant too much, if I'm not moving, even if it's just walking, right? Like even if I'm like in a place where I don't have time, but I feel it if I
Yeah.
don't move.
Yeah. Well, I know that because I know we did some yoga at the retreat, and I know that that was one thing that you really enjoyed doing because it felt good on your joints as well.
Yeah. So, and yoga has been, I would say, I think for me, like an on the mat, off the mat, like the physical component has been such a gift because it's like all movement I can do.
Mm,
Right. There's no high impact component. Like there's all, and even if like there's a thing I think I can't do, I now know how to make it all accessible. Like, and
yeah.
anyone can do yoga,
Yeah.
side message.
Yep.
Um, anyone can do yoga, and finding yoga teachers who know how to make yoga accessible is feasible and possible, and they are out there.
Yep.
Um, but I think for me, when I'm consistent about creating the space for doing yoga, my everything feels better.
Yeah.
Um, everything, and including my mental health. My mental health is better when I'm doing yoga.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
And it sounds like
yeah.
you're connected to your body and even like the data of your body, like more than you ever have been, which sounds like a pretty powerful position to be in.
Yeah, it's been really cool. There are times where whether it's like a patient I'm working with or I'm talking to a friend and they're like saying a thing, and I think now my struggle is I don't want to be like that person who's like,
Yeah.
if you did this, it might help. And so figuring out like my inroads sometimes, because I'm also aware of the fact that I don't have like a nutrition certification. I'm aware like there's all these things that I technically, don't have, like they're not my area of expertise professionally speaking.
Yep. Yep.
But I absolutely, one of the cool things about how this has been like linked into my work is I am much better about asking my patients, like, well, what do you eat? What does your diet consist of? And
Yeah.
I won't necessarily guide them with any concrete or specific way, but I do make referrals to dietitians who will.
Yeah. That's great to hear from my perspective.
Yeah, because well, it's like one of those things where, when you live in the place where you don't know what you don't know,
Yep.
and then once you do know, you're like, "Wait a minute.
Yeah.
There's all these things that could be making a difference for this person," and, like, making what I'm doing as a psychologist more accessible or feasible if I'm supporting things from a nutritional side,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, that's like you reading that book. I remember
mhm,
I watched Forks Over Knives, which kind of really opened my eyes. So, like you said, you don't know what you don't know. And then when your eyes are open to it, it's like, wow, there's potential for this to really have an impact on how I'm feeling or what my day-to-day routine is looking like, or potentially waking up with little pain or no pain, which is
yeah.
unheard of. I know for you, for like you said, 15 plus years.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, it's been really, nice because I'm like, I have such a supportive group of people I work with. Almost all of the people who I've, like, previously shared an office space with are either vegan or vegetarian for, like, animal rights reasons, which
Uh-huh.
is, like, bonus, we all eat the same way, so it's
Yes.
easy to, like who cares about the why? It just
Yep.
makes it, like, easy to be together, and so that's been really, really helpful. And then I think the other thing that for me, like in the beginning, I think my social circle wasn't super supportive. And as just like things have evolved over time, I have a social circle who is very supportive. I never like worry about what am I going to eat or am I going to be okay eating? I literally never feel like I have to worry about that when I'm in like my friends' homes, and I recognize that that is like a privilege and a gift that not everyone experiences.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and we do talk about that a lot. Like, if you can't experience that with, like, maybe immediate friends or family, like, try and find that community online because it is
Mhm.
helpful. It makes the journey so much just more enjoyable when you have a supportive community kind of backing you or at least, like, cheering you on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. And at first I definitely didn't, and then I was like
Yeah.
fortunate to really find that and
Yep.
create that, I think also. I'm a
Yeah. Yeah.
definitely a creator in that way. Yeah.
Yes. Did your sister end up saying anything since she was, like, vegan at one point?
So it was really funny. She's like, "Of course, now you're basically vegan,"
Yeah.
and she's not anymore. She is mostly still pretty like plant-based. Like, so it's easy to eat, but she definitely finds it to be amusing now. She's like,
Of
of
course.
course you are.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Kate, if someone's in your position, if they're listening to this and like they're kind of at this point where they're wanting to potentially make the transition, or maybe they have a pain point like you did, where it's like, I don't know if medication is really what I want to be on for the rest of my life. Maybe I want to potentially try something else. Not to say that medication is bad by any means, but maybe they're just looking for something different. Is there any advice you would give to someone who's considering it, but maybe on the fence, or is maybe just struggling with some of their own issues?
yeah, I mean, I think for the thing for me that really helped was like I thrive off of information.
Mm.
And so I would say like if I were giving advice to someone, it would be, well, look for the information that's out there. And if there is like a medical condition or a pain condition or any of those kinds of things, medicine has its place 100%. But I think that the power of how we can manage our inflammation levels or manage what's happening in our bodies with food is so underutilized in traditional medicine. And I know for me, so much of it has been feeling comfortable and confident of like looking for the information to be able to implement things on my own, and then feeling comfortable and confident to be an advocate for myself based on all of that information, and then really looking at the data of my experience. And I think about it like that, like what is like the data from my own body, the data from my own like pain level, like that's all information. It's data that then I can take and I can utilize to help like bolster my confidence in being an advocate for myself in those medical settings. um and I think that's even why I like jumped on wanting to like come talk to you today, is because I know how underutilized nutritional components are in traditional medicine. And that's, it's just so unfortunate because there's so many elements of why that happens that we won't
Yeah.
talk about right now.
Yes.
But but I was like, even if it's just hearing one person's story of how I've been super fortunate and able to manage my my medical presentation with food, really with food and lifestyle things.
Yeah.
um and that might not be everyone's experience, and I'm not by any means saying that it would be, but I think it can certainly be a huge complementary component that is not talked about enough.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. I like how you said that, a complementary component to really everything else that you could be doing. Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, well, thank you so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate it. And I just appreciate your transparency and being open and honest about everything too with your struggles.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. And like I said, I really do hope that even if it's just one person who listens and is like, "Hey, I have a medical thing," like
Yeah.
then that makes, you know, the sharing of the story totally worthwhile.
Yeah. And I like too that it wasn't like this overnight switch thing. Like it was like this 15-year journey. Then you read the book, and then it took you a few years to maybe find a doctor who like truly listened or that you aligned with. So
Hmm.
I think that's always a good reminder too, is that this is a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. And so just like kind of giving yourself some time, because you can't learn all the information at once, but the more you learn, the better off you are. Kind of like what Kate was doing, where she just was constantly taking in information and just learning more and more, even about her own body, which sometimes we don't take the time to do.
Yeah, yes, that's definitely part of it. I would say one of the things that I guess like surprise presence of like going plant-based is that like awareness of, oh, these are how these things impact my body and how I feel, and then how I can take that, it's all information, and I can take it to make mindful choices, to really guide my decisions in a way that helps me just be more deliberate, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not black or white, but it's all choices,
Yeah.
right? I can choose to stay up late and watch a show and recognize there's going to be an impact the next day, or I can shoot, right? It's choices and taking the information in and then using that to like navigate and guide how I like determine my actions. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Powerful
yeah.
stuff. If anyone's looking to connect with you on the social media, where would be the best place for them to do that?
All right. So the best way to find me is on Instagram. My profile is technically private, but you can still search me and message me. It's Kate Maria 22. And if you send me a message, I will, you know, definitely take a look and get back to you.
Nice. Wonderful. And we'll include that link. And then we'll also include the book that you mentioned as well, in case anyone's curious to check it out. I'm sure the library has it at the very least. So we'll include that as well in case people are curious, and some other fun things below in the show notes for you. So, Kate, thank you
Yeah.
again for being here. I really appreciate it. And the listeners appreciate it as well.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.
Good. All right. Thank you so much for listening. And we will catch you on the next episode. Until next time, keep thriving.